A widow surrounded by skulls. But why? Welcome to Midnight Radio Drama. I am your host, Wilfred. I love seeing this community grow. Tell me where you're tuning in from today. Hearing from you all makes this journey even more special. Let's begin. On a May morning of no particular distinction, the town of Flaxborough was engaged in the earnest but unremarkable matter of its annual Horticultural Society's spring display. Stalls of begonias and pelargoniums lined the market hall, each plant optimistically upright despite the draughts that crept in from doors held open by flower pots. The atmosphere, as usual, was part reverence and part rivalry. Retired bank clerks who fancied themselves horticultural savants circled the tables with the grave air of judges at a livestock fair, while their wives made delicate remarks about overfeeding or underwatering certain exhibits. Children were sternly warned not to sneeze on the roses. It was into this mild scene of civic pride that the disruption arrived in the form of Mrs. Troke. She was known to most simply as the Widow Troke, having lost her husband in an accident so many years ago that many doubted whether the title widow was still a necessary prefix. Still, she wore it as firmly as she did her black felt hat, which no one in living memory had seen replaced. Mrs. Troke was not ordinarily one to attract attention. Her presence was marked mainly by a faint but continuous cough, like a small engine struggling to idle. But this morning she carried with her a cardboard box. The manner in which she carried it, gingerly, as one bears either kittens or explosives, drew more than the usual number of eyes as she advanced to the centre of the hall. She placed the box upon a table reserved for unusual curiosities of nature, a category that traditionally admitted such items as twisted root vegetables, freakishly large eggs, and the occasional pressed flower that had contrived to retain a trace of its colour since the previous century. When she opened the box, however, what emerged was not a potato shaped like a bishop, nor an improbably sized marrow. It was a skull, a human skull. There was a polite pause, as though the object might yet be explained into something less awkward. Then came the expected murmurs, a small fluttering of remarks that rose and fell like sparrows startled by a sudden draught. Mrs. Troke, however, was entirely composed. She patted the box as if to settle it. "My late husband," she announced, not loudly, but with clear authority, "collected them." He always thought a nice clean skull far more instructive than any picture book. Several of the assembled audience managed faint smiles as though humouring eccentricity were the only civil option. Others, less tactful, leaned in closer to examine the skull's discoloured sockets with fascinated unease. The vicar's wife was heard to whisper, "Oh, surely it isn't real," though her expression suggested she would be almost disappointed to be told otherwise. By the time the mayor, looking very much as if he wished to be anywhere else, had arranged for the box and its contents to be discreetly moved to a back room, the tale of the Widow Troke's skull had already begun to spread. It was relayed by children to their mothers with suitably enlarged detail, and by those mothers to shopkeepers with further embellishment, until by the close of market hours the town's more impressionable citizens were convinced that Mrs. Troke had appeared with a whole sack of skulls, each labelled and dated. Back at the police station, the duty sergeant had not been able to suppress a small chuckle when reporting the matter to Inspector Purbright. "A skull, sir. Brought it along as if it were an exhibit. Says her husband collected them." Purbright, who had been adding neat lines to a file, looked up only long enough to raise his eyebrows in mild acknowledgment. He had long ago discovered that the best course with sergeants reporting the improbable was neither enthusiasm nor dismissal, but the sort of silence that gently compelled them to add the details they thought he wanted. The sergeant obliged. Course, could be nothing. but folk seemed a bit put out. And the mayor, well, he thought perhaps we'd better check it was all proper like. Purbright allowed a very small smile. Yes, quite. A skull in a cardboard box does tend to distract from the begonias. The sergeant grinned, encouraged. Shall I bring it in, sir? Purbright tapped his pencil twice against the file before setting it down. Yes, I think we ought to have a look. After all, one does like to know whose company one is keeping in the market hall. And so it was that the afternoon promised not the usual paperwork of bicycle thefts and stray dogs, but the rather less commonplace matter of determining why a quiet widow had chosen to display a human skull among the chrysanthemums. The skull, once it had been carried from the market hall to the police station, sat for some hours in the custody of Constable Malley, who had been given the unenviable task of storing it somewhere secure but not alarming. After rejecting the filing cabinet on grounds of dignity and the lost property cupboard on grounds of space, Malley finally set it on a shelf otherwise reserved for oversize umbrellas. He covered it with a brown paper bag, though not before giving it one long, wary glance, as if half expecting the bone grin to widen at his expense. By tea time, the skull had become less an object than a story, and one not likely to diminish with repetition. In Flaxborough, nothing so eagerly displaced the town's fondness for horticulture and municipal trivialities as a whiff of the macabre. By evening, the version circulating at the Duke of St. Simon Arms had grown elaborate enough to include not only a skull, but an entire skeleton carted in by the widow Troke, with the help of two unseen accomplices. One listener swore that his cousin's neighbour had heard a rattle of bones from the market hall, though he admitted when pressed that it might have been the florist's delivery van negotiating a cobbled corner. Mrs. Troke herself, meanwhile, maintained a composure that was at once reassuring and troubling. She returned home from the market carrying a loaf and a jar of potted shrimp, and acknowledged her neighbour's polite curiosity with that faint smile of hers which never seemed to imply more than she intended. The widow's house, a neat, semi-detached, with lace curtains that never failed to billow at the least draught, now became the subject of speculative glances from passers-by. If she noticed, she gave no sign. Inspector Purbright, who was not often one for rushing, saw no reason to change his habits on account of a box and its contents. He spent the afternoon at his desk, listening with half an ear to the station telephone, while sergeants and constables relayed fresh additions to the tale. By 5:30, the skull had become something of a civic personality in itself. At 6 o'clock, Purbright rose, placed his pencil in the precise centre groove of his blotter, and announced that he would pay a call on Mrs. Troke. The widow received him with the calmness of a woman accustomed to visitors who found themselves intrigued by her habits. She ushered him into a parlour that smelt faintly of furniture polish and camphor, and gestured to a chair that had clearly not been sat in since before the war. "I imagine," she said, folding her hands, "you've come about Henry's things." Purbright, who had not been given the name, inclined his head politely. "Your late husband, madam?" She nodded. "He was always fond of skulls, not in an unpleasant way, you understand. He collected them the way some men collect stamps or buttons. I dare say he thought it gave him a better understanding of people." The inspector's expression suggested nothing more than courteous interest. "And were there many such items in his collection?" "Oh, yes," Mrs. Troke replied, with a certain pride. "9 altogether, all quite genuine, too. He would never have tolerated those plaster things. We had them on a shelf in the spare room. I dusted them once a week." Purbright allowed a pause to open between them, as if he were considering the domestic implications of such a routine. Then, "And the one you displayed today, was that your husband's favourite?" "Oh, no, not at all." It was merely the most convenient to carry. The others are rather heavy, you see. I thought the Horticultural Society might appreciate something out of the ordinary. One can grow weary of marrows, don't you find? It was not an easy proposition to dispute. Purbright asked if he might look at the remaining items, and Mrs. Troke, with the resigned air of one indulging a guest's politeness, led him upstairs. The spare bedroom bore the unmistakable mark of long-term widowhood, orderly, quiet, and faintly melancholy. On a high shelf stood 8 skulls, each pale and polished to a sheen that suggested years of dutiful dusting. They were arranged in a row with a curious sense of ceremony, as if they were spectators to some invisible performance. Purbright approached them with the detached care one reserves for objects of uncertain provenance. He noted the smoothness of their crowns, the dark recesses of the sockets, and the faintly varied colouring that hinted at differing ages. He did not, however, reach to touch them. "They are," he remarked softly, "remarkably well kept." Mrs. Troke seemed pleased. "Henry always said people neglect bones. They're as much a part of God's work as roses or songbirds. He believed in respecting them." Purbright made a small note in his pocketbook, though what he wrote would have been illegible even to himself. He replaced the pencil deliberately and offered his thanks. That evening, at the Nag's Head, the matter of the widow's collection was dissected at length. Mr. Kringle, who had retired from the railway some years earlier, but not from the hobby of repeating half-heard news, claimed that the police had discovered dozens of skulls stacked like firewood in her loft. Mrs. Spatley, who kept the haberdasher's shop, countered that she had heard there were only 3, but that each one belonged to a man who had mysteriously vanished after courting the widow. The landlord merely shook his head and pulled pints, having learnt long ago that no rumour in Flaxborough ever diminished by contradiction. Purbright, for his part, refrained from offering any comment to his sergeant beyond a request that someone discreetly make inquiries into the late Henry Troke's occupation and acquaintances. "One never knows," he observed mildly, "where a fondness for bones may have originated." The following morning brought drizzle, which in Flaxborough usually meant the streets smelled of cabbage and coal dust. By 9 o'clock the skulls had been officially removed from Mrs. Troke's house to the police station for safe keeping. Constable Malley, who carried them in 2 cardboard boxes, did so with the unease of a man half expecting his burdens to complain aloud. He deposited them in the evidence room and took care not to linger. Word of the removal spread quickly, as such things did. By lunchtime, the town's respectable ladies were weighing the likelihood that poor Mrs. Troke would soon be arrested, while their husbands opined that the police had far better things to do than meddle with souvenirs of anatomy. One elderly resident declared that she distinctly remembered a travelling lecturer on phrenology coming through town 40 years ago, and that the widow's husband must surely have been his assistant. This explanation satisfied precisely no one, but it lent an air of scholarship to the gossip. Meanwhile, Purbright had received a discreet file from Sergeant Love, who had turned up nothing remarkable about Henry Troke, save that he had been a clerk at a solicitor's office, and that his only known hobby had been indeed the collection of skulls. The file, however, did contain one curious note. In 1937, there had been an inquest into the disappearance of a lodger from the Troke household, a young man employed at the brewery. The verdict had been misadventure, though the details were vague. Purbright reread the page slowly, then set it down. The drizzle outside had become steady rain, and through the station window the inspector watched a succession of umbrellas pass like dull beetles along the high street. He tapped the file gently, as though persuading it to divulge something further. At length he said to no one in particular, 9 skulls, when one might reasonably Expect only 8. That is what interests me. The following morning's edition of the Flaxborough Citizen featured on its second page, beneath a photograph of the mayor planting a rosebush, the first official account of the Skull affair. The tone was one of cautious levity. Unusual incident at Market Hall. Horticultural display diversified by widow's contribution. The article referred politely to Mrs. Troke's antique specimen, assured readers that the police were making routine inquiries, and added, with a faint note of civic pride, that no other market town of the county can boast so singular an exhibit. By breakfast, the paper was being discussed over eggs and bacon at every respectable table in Flaxborough. Those inclined to anxiety murmured about dreadful goings-on, while those with a sense of humour saw the whole matter as a welcome relief from the monotony of potholes and rising rates. Mrs. Mounts, who presided over the Women's Institute as firmly as she presided over her husband's diet, read the piece aloud to her neighbour across the hedge. "A collection," she declared, with an emphasis that implied moral certainty, "is one thing, but 9, that suggests obsession." Her neighbour, a retired confectioner, nodded vigorously. "And obsession," she added, "never leads to anything good. Look at stamp collectors, all that paper, and not a thought for the dust." By mid-morning, the skulls themselves had become an object of pilgrimage. The police station, never a place of much interest to the public save for the occasional lost dog notice, suddenly found itself the focus of sidelong glances and speculative loitering. Housewives with errands conveniently passing the building would pause to whisper about what might be happening inside. A milk delivery boy reported later that he had overheard 2 ladies debating whether the inspector was secretly an expert in witchcraft. Within the station, the skulls sat in their boxes, silent but commanding more attention than the town's entire history of bicycle thefts. Constable Malley, having once more been assigned as custodian, declared privately that the sooner the lot were put back into the widow's spare room, the happier he should be. Inspector Purbright, however, showed no sign of hurry. He had arranged for each skull to be photographed, labelled, and placed upon a separate shelf. Their neat alignment gave the impression of a class photograph in which none of the subjects had survived the term. That afternoon, Purbright received a call from the coroner's office. The pathologist, having been prevailed upon to examine one of the specimens, offered a verdict of calm, professional vagueness. The skulls were genuine, certainly. They had belonged to adults, probably, and at least one bore marks that might suggest an unorthodox removal from its former owner. The coroner added, with dry detachment, that the matter did not resemble any recognized branch of hobbyism. Purbright thanked him with his customary courtesy and put down the telephone. He then summoned Sergeant Love. "Love," he said, "it seems we must learn rather more about Mr. Troke. His taste in souvenirs, while unusual, is not altogether without precedent, but provenance, you see, that is the point." The sergeant, who had never been entirely at ease with words of more than 3 syllables, shifted uneasily. "You mean where he got 'em, sir?" "Precisely. People do not generally lose their heads without leaving some record of the fact." Love promised to look into burial registers, mortuary logs, and such like, though his expression suggested a strong preference for bicycle thefts. While the police applied themselves to dull research, the town pursued its own inquiries with far more zest. By tea-time, at least 3 versions of Henry Troke's life were circulating, none of them resembling the truth. According to one, he had been a grave robber who supplied medical schools. According to another, he had been a foreign spy with a taste for trophies. The most popular story, however, was that he had killed each skull's original owner in a fit of passion, and that his widow had only now decided to share his dreadful legacy as a sort of confession. The widow Troke herself showed little inclination to confirm or deny. she was observed shopping as usual at the butcher's, where she requested 2 lamb chops in her quiet, matter-of-fact manner. When the butcher's wife, in the spirit of neighbourly probing, remarked that it must be trying to have the police in one's home, Mrs. Troke simply smiled and replied, "Oh, they were very tidy." The widow's composure, far from calming the town, only deepened its fascination. Some admired her fortitude, others suspected calculation. It was generally agreed that a woman who could dust skulls weekly for decades without blanching must possess either uncommon strength of mind or uncommon secrets. Purbright, meanwhile, began his round of polite inquiries. He visited the solicitor's office where Henry Troke had once worked. The senior clerk, a man whose spectacles magnified his eyes into owlish globes, recalled the deceased only vaguely. Punctual fellow, quiet, never had much to say beyond the weather, kept to himself, you know. Oh, except for his interest in bones, of course. Purbright's brows rose faintly. He spoke of it here? Not often, but once he brought in a jawbone, said it was for comparison. The inspector allowed the faintest of nods, though his gaze wandered to the neat rows of ledgers along the office walls. He wondered, as he so often did, how many lives of quiet peculiarity were hidden behind the facade of small-town respectability. At the library, where Mrs. Troke was known to borrow books of gardening advice, the librarian produced a yellowing register of past loans. To Purbright's quiet satisfaction, several volumes on anatomy and phrenology were recorded under her husband's name. Popular in the 1930s, the librarian observed primly, though not so much requested now. The inspector thanked her and stepped back into the drizzle. He had by then the beginnings of a picture. A man unremarkable in all things save one eccentric obsession, a widow untroubled by the relics he left behind, and a town determined to embroider both into something far grander than truth. That evening, in the quiet of his office, Purbright sat considering his notes. 9 skulls, each carefully kept. One disappeared lodger whose inquest 30 years ago had closed with suspicious haste. A widow of calm demeanour, neither distressed by the police nor apologetic for her collection. He leaned back in his chair, clasping his hands lightly upon his waistcoat. It was not, in his judgment, the number of skulls that troubled him most. It was the habit of dusting them. For collections of eccentric men often became the burdens of their widows, yet few such burdens were borne with such tranquillity. A knock at the door interrupted his reflection. Sergeant Love entered, clutching a damp notebook. "Sir," he said, "but there's something else. We've had word from a farmer just outside town. Says his grandfather once mentioned a grave that weren't quite right. Up by the disused chapel, near the boundary hedge. Could be nothing, of course." Purbright's expression did not change, but his eyes seemed to sharpen with quiet interest. "Yes, love, quite possibly nothing, but perhaps we should take a look all the same." The sergeant shifted uneasily, glancing at the rain on the window. "Tonight, sir?" "Tomorrow will do," Purbright replied mildly. "The dead, in my experience, are patient." And with that, he returned to his notes, leaving Love to wonder whether the inspector's remark was intended to be reassuring or otherwise. Outside, the drizzle thickened into steady rain, washing the cobblestones clean of gossip for an hour or two, though no doubt by morning the talk would resume with greater vigour. For Flaxborough had been offered at last a story worthy of speculation, a widow, a shelf of skulls, and the faint, persistent suspicion that one of them might not have been acquired entirely by chance. It was remarkable, though perhaps not surprising, how quickly the skulls ceased to be mere curiosities and became the stuff of moral debate. By the time Sunday arrived, the matter had migrated from the snug of the Nag's Head to the pulpit of St. Swithin's. The Reverend Chubb, A man generally more inclined to sermonize on the virtues of patience at traffic lights or charity towards retired postmen devoted a portion of his homily to the unhealthy appetite for sensational relics. The congregation listened with varying degrees of piety and boredom. Mrs. Pumphrey, who had once fainted at the sight of a pheasant being plucked, nodded vigorously whenever morbid was uttered. Others glanced slyly toward the widow Troke herself, seated primly in her usual pew and showing no hint of disturbance at being the object, however obliquely, of their minister's exhortations. If she felt the weight of the town's attention, she bore it lightly. After the service, she exchanged polite remarks with neighbours in the churchyard, her manner as placid as if the subject were weather rather than a shelf of skulls. She even accepted an invitation to tea from the vicar's wife, who extended it with the curiosity of one eager to look inside another woman's cupboards. By Monday morning, the gossip had shifted from the existence of the skulls to the question of their ownership. Several of the town's amateur historians, never slow to sense an opportunity for relevance, descended upon the cemetery registers with enthusiasm. One claimed to have discovered that 2 graves in the older part of the churchyard were shorter than regulation length and therefore suspect. Another reported that a mason's account from 1929 showed a headstone ordered but never erected. That these discoveries bore only tenuous relation to the Troke household mattered little. What counted was the sense that Flaxborough, beneath its calm exterior, might conceal a history darker than cabbage-growing contests. Inspector Purbright watched all this unfold with the quiet detachment of a gardener observing weeds spring up exactly where expected. He had instructed Sergeant Love to make careful note of each rumour that surfaced, not for their accuracy, but for the picture they painted of what townsfolk wanted to believe. Human motive, he reflected, was often revealed more clearly in gossip than in evidence. By Tuesday, the investigation had taken a more deliberate step. Purbright, with his customary politeness, requested the coroner's permission to examine the site near the disused chapel that the farmer's grandson had mentioned. A constable was dispatched to secure the area, which consisted of a patch of nettle-ridden ground beside a crumbling stone wall. Here, half buried under decades of neglect, lay what might once have been a grave, though the mound was irregular, and the headstone, if it ever existed, had vanished. A small team began the slow business of excavation. The townsfolk, having scented activity, appeared in a steady trickle to watch from beyond the hedge. They stood in clusters, umbrellas tilted against drizzle, their faces bright with the thrill of sanctioned morbid curiosity. It was, after all, not every week that one might witness the uncovering of something long buried. By late afternoon, the constables had unearthed what appeared to be fragments of bone. A skull, too weathered to match the polished specimens from the Troke home, was carefully lifted from the soil. There was a murmur among the onlookers, and 1 or 2 crossed themselves in reflex. Purbright, standing slightly apart, observed with his hands folded behind his back. His expression did not alter, though his gaze lingered on the irregularity of the soil around the find. He made a brief note in his pocketbook and then, with characteristic mildness, suggested that the work be halted until the light improved the following morning. The next day's paper carried the story with as much relish as its editor dared. Another skull in outlying parish, police examination underway. Though the article refrained from naming Mrs. Troke directly, the implication was clear enough to any reader with even a modest appetite for inference. The widow Troke herself remained unruffled. When a reporter called at her house in hopes of a quotation, she declined politely but firmly, explaining that she had a soufflé in the oven. The young man departed with nothing more than a glimpse of lace curtains and a faint smell of lavender polish. Back at the police station, Sergeant Love voiced the unease that had been growing since the excavation. "Suppose, sir, this other skull belongs with the rest. Makes 10, doesn't it? Bit more than a collection, that." Purbright tapped his pencil against his notebook, eyes half closed in thought. "Quite. But let us not hurry to arithmetic. Numbers can mislead. The important question is not how many skulls there are, but whether each can be accounted for without resorting to melodrama." Love frowned. "Seems to me, sir, melodrama's what the whole town's set on." The inspector permitted himself the faintest of smiles. "Indeed, which is why we must be patient. People will always provide explanations if we give them time. It is usually in their eagerness to explain that the truth appears." Over the following days, Purbright pursued his inquiries with deliberate courtesy. He visited the widow again, asking whether her late husband had ever spoken of the chapel or its grounds. Mrs. Troke, pouring tea with steady hands, said no. Henry had never been one for churches. She seemed entirely unsurprised to hear of another skull being found. "Henry would have approved," she remarked, passing him a plate of currant cake. "He always said there were more bones about than people like to admit. We tidy them away and then act shocked when they show themselves again." Her remark, delivered without the faintest trace of malice, stayed with Purbright after he left the house. There was, he reflected, something peculiarly untroubled in her acceptance of the macabre. Either she was profoundly innocent, or she had long ago accommodated herself to a truth she had no intention of sharing. Meanwhile, the gossip thickened. The discovery near the chapel was said to prove that the Trokes had once buried their enemies there, or, alternatively, that witches had used the site for rituals, with Henry as their custodian. A few imaginative souls suggested that the skulls were part of a treasure map, each hollowed bone concealing a clue. The police, overhearing such theories, recorded them dutifully, though with expressions of weary disbelief. Yet beneath the absurdity, Purbright sensed the shape of something more substantial. The missing lodger of 1937 hovered at the edge of his thoughts. If one skull belonged to that unfortunate, then what of the others? And why had no one ever asked, until now, where Henry Troke had found his trophies? On Thursday evening, Purbright sat late in his office, the town outside already shuttered and quiet. He reviewed his notes, 9 skulls from the widow's house, 1 from the chapel ground, and a history of silence surrounding both. He leaned back, fingers steepled, and considered the nature of small towns. They tolerated eccentricities readily enough, collections of buttons, cabinets of stuffed birds, shelves of pressed flowers. But when the eccentricity strayed too close to human remains, the tolerance gave way to fascination edged with fear. What troubled Purbright was not the widow's calm, nor the town's appetite for tales, but the odd absence of outrage from those who had known Henry Troke in life. No clerk, no neighbour, no acquaintance had expressed surprise that he collected skulls. They remembered him as quiet, dull, unremarkable, save for this one habit. It was as if they had all conspired, consciously or not, to accept the peculiar as natural, provided it did not disturb their own routines. Purbright closed his notebook with a soft snap. He would, he decided, have to disturb those routines a little. There was, in every collection, one piece that did not belong. The challenge lay in discerning which skull was the intruder among its well-polished companions. And until he did, the town of Flaxborough would continue to murmur, embroider, and wait with morbid eagerness for the next bone to surface. By the end of the week, Flaxborough had settled into a rhythm of watchfulness, rather like a village cat crouched at a mouse hole. The skulls, boxed and labelled in the police station evidence room, exerted a fascination far out of proportion to their silent presence. Housewives, passing the station with shopping baskets on their arms, could not resist a glance at its windows as though expecting a grinning face to peer out. The landlord of the Nag's Head reported that his evening trade had doubled since the affair began, thanks to patrons eager to debate whether the town was harbouring a murderess, an eccentric, or perhaps a saint misunderstood. The widow Troke herself was the object of endless speculation. Some declared she was entirely innocent, a victim of her late husband's peculiar hobby. Others whispered that she dusted the skulls with too much devotion to be blameless. One particularly daring rumour claimed she spoke to them at night, arranging them in new orders to hold silent conversations. That the neighbours, who surely would have overheard, denied this emphatically, did little to stem the tale. Inspector Purbright, who had grown adept at listening to nonsense without betraying amusement, allowed these rumours to collect like dead leaves. They were useful in their way. People often revealed more about themselves when they gossiped than when they were formally questioned. Still, his attention remained fixed upon the hard fact of one particular skull, the 10th, unearthed beside the chapel. Unlike the polished and domestic specimens from the Troke home, this one had lain in the earth for decades, its surfaces roughened, a patch of soil clinging stubbornly in one socket. "Not Henry's housekeeping, that one?" Sergeant Love remarked when it was set among the others. "Indeed not," Purbright replied mildly. "It has lacked the attentions of a feather duster, and of Mrs. Troke." He left the implication hanging, as was his habit, letting his sergeant puzzle over what precisely he meant. That same afternoon, a letter arrived at the police station. Written in a hand so crabbed it might have been traced by an arthritic spider, it announced itself as the recollection of one, Miss Blenkinsop, now resident in a home for gentlewomen. She wished to draw attention to an incident in 1937, when she had been employed as a domestic at the Trokes' house. A lodger, she wrote, had disappeared suddenly. She had asked Mrs. Troke about it and was told he had gone abroad. Yet Miss Blenkinsop remembered distinctly finding a torn waistcoat in the scullery bin and hearing, late one night, a sound of heavy dragging across the floorboards. The letter was brought to Purbright with a sense of suppressed excitement, as though it might at last confirm all the town's wild suspicions. The inspector read it slowly, his expression remaining placid. He folded it neatly and placed it in a file. "Shall we take it seriously, sir?" Love asked, half hoping for melodrama. Purbright looked at him kindly. "My dear Love, in Flaxborough, one takes everything seriously. One merely refrains from believing it at once." Nevertheless, he instructed the sergeant to pay a call at the gentlewomen's home. Love returned with a report that Miss Blenkinsop was alert, sharp-tongued, and delighted to have visitors. She repeated her story with embellishments, claiming that she had also seen Henry Troke once in the garden with a sack that was not potatoes. She could not, however, recall what became of the sack, nor could she describe the missing lodger in more than vague terms. A young man with brownish hair, perhaps, or fairish, and rather thin. It might, Love observed afterwards, have been any man at all. "Quite," Purbright agreed. "Which is what makes her account so useful. It will be believed by those who wish to believe it, and doubted by those who prefer doubt. Meanwhile, we must determine whether there is one skull too many." The question, deceptively simple, required more patience than most townsfolk could muster. For them, the drama lay in imagination. For Purbright, in quiet persistence. He visited the parish archives, speaking politely to a verger whose moustache bristled with suspicion at the mention of graves. He consulted the county records office, where a clerk produced, after much sighing, the coroner's files of 1937. These revealed the inquest into the lodger's disappearance, conducted with remarkable brevity. The verdict, misadventure, had been reached despite a conspicuous absence of evidence as to how or where the man had misadventured. Purbright read the report twice, then placed it back with a little bow of thanks to the clerk. Back in Flaxborough, the investigation assumed a subtler form. The inspector began to call quietly on those elderly residents who had been young in the 1930s. He did so not with the brusque demands of a policeman, but with the courtesy of a man making social calls. Over tea, he listened while they reminisced about dances, war rumours, and the price of sugar. Gradually, fragments emerged, recollections of a cheerful lodger at the Troke's house, remembered by some as working at the brewery. Others spoke of his sudden absence. Few had thought much of it at the time. It was in these small conversations, marked by pauses and sidelong glances, that Purbright felt the shape of truth stirring, not the truth itself, never offered so easily, but the outline of it, like a shadow glimpsed behind a curtain. Meanwhile, the town council convened in some agitation. Several members, eager to restore Flaxborough's reputation, proposed that the skulls be quietly returned to the widow and the matter declared closed. Others argued, with equal fervour, that the discovery offered a chance for cultural tourism. One councillor suggested an exhibition, the Troke Collection, a study in local peculiarities. The mayor, who feared ridicule from the county press, postponed any decision. Purbright attended none of these meetings, but he heard of them afterwards with the faintest twitch of amusement. "The urge to display," he remarked to his sergeant, "is almost as strong as the urge to conceal. Both tell us something if we listen." It was late on Friday afternoon, with drizzle streaking the police station windows, that the first real fissure appeared in the calm facade of the case. A letter arrived, unsigned, delivered by hand. Its few words, written in shaky pencil, read, "Ask the widow why there are 10 when Henry only ever had 8. The inspector sat with the note in his hand for some time. At last, he placed it beside the earlier letter from Miss Blenkinsop and studied the two together. There was no certainty in either, and yet between them lay a suggestion, faint but persistent, that one skull had joined the collection by means other than purchase or gift. He rose, smoothed his coat, and told Love he would take a walk. The sergeant, glancing at the rain outside, asked whether he ought to accompany him. "No, Love," said Purbright gently. "Sometimes one must meet silence with silence. Besides, a widow is less inclined to talk in the presence of an audience." And so, as twilight fell, the inspector walked alone through damp streets towards the neat, semi-detached house where Mrs. Troke kept her lace curtains drawn against the world. He walked without hurry, the raindrops stippling his hat, his expression calm. For in Purbright's mind the affair was no longer a curiosity, nor even a scandal. It was a question, stark and unavoidable. Which skull upon that shelf of 9 did not truly belong? The answer, he knew, would not be found in the chatter of townsfolk, nor in the dusty pages of records. It would be found in the widow's eyes, her pauses, and the small betrayals of manner that emerged when a polite question was asked with quiet persistence. He tapped at her door precisely as the church clock struck 7. The widow, when she opened it, looked neither surprised nor displeased. She merely inclined her head and said, "Inspector?" "Do come in. I was just setting another place at table." For the first time, Purbright allowed his brows to lift, just a fraction. "Another place, madam?" Her faint smile did not waver. "For Henry, of course. One must never neglect the dead." Purbright stepped across the threshold, his manner courteous as ever, but his thoughts sharpening like a knife drawn slowly from its sheath. Mrs. Troke's dining room possessed the peculiar solemnity of a chapel that had been converted into a tea room. The lace curtains dulled the street lamps outside into smudges of yellow, and the furniture, ponderous oak chairs, a table whose polish bore the depth of decades, seemed arranged less for comfort than for the enactment of some obscure ritual. Upon the sideboard, 3 candlesticks burned with steady flames, and in the centre of the table stood a single plate already furnished with knife, fork, and napkin folded precisely in a triangle. Inspector Purbright, following his hostess's gesture, seated himself opposite the vacant place. The widow busied herself with a pot of tea, her movements as unhurried as those of a person accustomed to being observed. If she was perturbed by a policeman at her table, she gave no sign. "It is a habit of mine, Inspector," she said at length, pouring into his cup. "Henry did so enjoy a little order about his meals. I continue it, well, in spirit, you understand." Purbright inclined his head. "Continuity may be a comfort. It is more than that. It is a duty." She set the teapot down firmly. "I have kept faith with Henry in all respects, even when others fail to appreciate." Her eyes lingered upon him with a glimmer of challenge, as though daring him to dispute her fidelity. Purbright only sipped his tea. The widow smiled faintly, disappointed. They conversed in small ways for several minutes. She inquired whether the police station's roof still leaked, and he told her it did. She observed that the roses in the market square looked poorly this season, and he agreed. Gradually, the inspector allowed the conversation to drift towards the matter of the skulls. Mr. Troke was much admired for his unusual tastes, Purbright said gently. The widow's expression softened, as though a caress had passed across her features. "Henry had an eye, Inspector. Where others saw mere relics, he perceived individuality. Each skull bore a history, a voice even. And all 9 of those voices," Purbright observed mildly, "were purchased or obtained by Mr. Troke himself." Her pause was brief, but visible. 9? There are 10. "Indeed, but of the 9 you have displayed so carefully at home, may I assume all were his acquisitions?" She tilted her head, considering. "To the best of my recollection, yes." "To the best of recollection," Purbright repeated, as though turning over the phrase like a coin of uncertain metal. He did not press her further. Instead, he set his cup aside and asked, "Did Mr. Troke ever speak of disposing of the collection?" "Never. It was his pride. He once said that the shelves would not be truly complete until they represented every condition of man." "And did he achieve that?" Her eyes flickered. "Perhaps, perhaps not. Henry was secretive in his way, even with me." The inspector rose soon afterwards, declining her offer of cake. He left her with a bow and a few polite words, but as he stepped into the drizzle of the evening, his thoughts were unsettled. The widow had spoken truth in parts, he was certain, but also evasion. The 10th skull still hovered in his mind like an uninvited guest at the table. The following morning, Sergeant Love burst into the inspector's office with his usual lack of ceremony. "Sir, I've been asking round at the library. The librarian says she remembers Henry Troke in the 30s, took out books on anatomy, medical illustrations, that sort of thing. Not unusual, I suppose, given his hobby. But she swears he once asked for a book on concealment of remains. She thought it a joke." Purbright raised an eyebrow. People who joke about such matters are rarely amusing. "Do you think," Love ventured, "that Henry killed this lodger Miss Blenkinsop mentioned? Buried him, and then... well?" He trailed off, conscious of the inspector's dislike of premature conclusions. Purbright interlaced his fingers. "If Henry Troke did, then the matter is now beyond the reach of earthly justice. Our concern, Love, is with the living." "You mean the widow?" The inspector smiled thinly. I mean the widow. Over the next days, Purbright orchestrated a quiet inquiry. Without fanfare, constables re-examined the chapel grounds, widening the area beyond the original discovery. They unearthed nothing further, but in the soil where the 10th skull had lain, Purbright found the impression of decayed cloth, fragments of coarse fabric, perhaps once belonging to a sack. He had them sent to the county laboratory, though he knew results would be long in coming. Meanwhile, he sought out another voice from the past. Mr. Laker, a retired brewer, lived in a narrow house near the canal. He was rheumy-eyed but sharp, and when Purbright mentioned the lodger, he nodded slowly. "Yes, I remember him. Young fellow, helped at the brewery for a few weeks. Name, gone from me. Quiet chap, though. Then one day, gone. Just like that." "Do you recall any quarrel with the Trokes?" "None, but I heard Henry tell someone at the Nag's Head that the lad had prospects abroad. Didn't seem convincing, mind, more like he was telling himself." Purbright thanked him and walked back through the damp streets. The pieces were forming, not into a picture, but into a puzzle, with one piece deliberately obscured. That evening, as he and Love reviewed their notes, a constable entered with news. A boy playing by the river had found a length of bone among the reeds. It proved to be human, old and weathered, not from a skull, but a leg. Purbright's calm face revealed nothing, but inside him a slow current of certainty began to move. "Love," he said, "I think it is time we asked the widow once more. This time, not about Henry's collection, but about Henry himself." The sergeant blinked. "You don't think—" "I think," Purbright interrupted gently, "that Mrs. Troke has kept more than one kind of faith with her husband, and faith, when carried too far, can conceal more than devotion. It can conceal guilt, whether one's own or another's." The discovery of the bone became public knowledge within hours, for in Flaxborough no fact lingered long in official hands before seeping into tavern talk. By the following morning, speculation roared anew. Some swore the widow had kept whole skeletons, others that the river itself was full of bones. A wag at the Nag's Head declared he would not eat fish for fear of biting on a knuckle. Purbright ignored the tumult. He prepared instead for a second visit to the widow, one that would not be softened with polite tea. He intended this time to bring Sergeant Love and to ask questions not of the collection but of Henry Troke's final days, for in the inspector's patient mind a single notion had begun to harden into probability, that the 10th skull was not a trophy acquired by Henry Troke at all, but rather the memorial of some quiet violence Henry himself might not have survived. And if that was true, then the widow's carefully laid table, with its extra place, was not a gesture of devotion. It was a ritual of concealment enacted daily, as though by repeating it she might persuade the world, and perhaps herself, that Henry was still among the living. Purbright folded his notes, extinguished the lamp upon his desk, and said quietly to Love, "Tomorrow we shall knock at her door again. Let us hope she prefers honesty to ceremony." The sergeant swallowed hard. "And if she doesn't, sir?" "Then," said Purbright, with the faintest shadow of a smile, "we must be prepared to listen to what the dead themselves have to tell us." The following morning broke in a hush that felt unnatural, as though the town itself held its breath in anticipation of the inspector's next step. A pall of mist lay thick across the streets of Flaxborough, muffling the clip of hooves, the chime of shop bells, and even the argumentative calls of traders in the square. It was into this atmosphere of uneasy quiet that Inspector Purbright and Sergeant Love walked, their figures softened by the grey. The pair kept a steady pace, their silence companionable, yet taut with unspoken expectation. At precisely 9 they reached the narrow gate of the Troke house. The garden, such as it was, offered a bedraggled tangle of privet and nettle, its paths glistening with dew. Mrs. Troke had already opened her door. She stood framed in the entrance, stiff and composed, her black dress buttoned high to the throat. A white apron glimmered faintly in the gloom, immaculate. "You are punctual, Inspector," she said, her voice cool as polished metal. "I thought you might come." Purbright inclined his head. "We were grateful for your hospitality on our last visit. This time, however, we hope for something more substantial than tea." Her lips curved, not in humour, but as though she acknowledged a duel. "Then you had best come in." The dining room was much as before, though the candles were not yet lit. In their stead, pale daylight strained through the curtains, revealing dust motes like restless spirits. Again, the table bore 2 places set with precision, though neither was yet touched with food. Sergeant Love cast the second setting a quick glance before seating himself. He could not prevent his shoulders from tightening, as though he feared the unseen occupant might at any moment arrive to claim it. Purbright waited until Mrs. Troke had seated herself before he spoke. "Madam, a human skull was found upon the chapel grounds. You are aware of this, of course?" "I read the newspapers." "Inspector." "And now a bone, part of a leg, has been recovered by the river." Her expression remained placid. "Children are forever finding curiosities. I recall one bringing me what he swore was a mermaid's tail. It proved to be a haddock." "Alas, madam," Purbright said gently, "this is no haddock." The silence lengthened. Then the widow's gaze shifted to the empty place at the table. Her hands, folded neatly before her, did not stir. "You think I am keeping something," she said at last. "Something dreadful." "I think," Purbright replied, "that you are keeping someone." The words fell with quiet weight. Sergeant Love shifted uneasily in his chair, but Mrs. Troke only lowered her eyes as though considering the grain of the polished wood. After a long pause, she said, "Henry is dead. If you hoped I would deny it, you are disappointed." Love blinked. Purbright remained immobile, save for the faint tilt of his head. "When did he die?" "Nearly 20 years ago. One winter evening. He did not come in for supper. I found him in the cellar. He had struck his head, perhaps in a fall." The widow's voice was flat, drained of all drama. "He was gone before I reached him. There was no doctor. I was alone." Purbright's calm did not falter, but, inwardly, his thoughts began to order themselves. "The cellar, an accident," she said. "Yet why no report? Why conceal?" "You did not inform the authorities?" he asked. She shook her head once, firmly. Henry would not have wished the indignity, to be buried by strangers, dissected, or examined like a criminal. He abhorred it. And so I kept him, at first whole, then when time demanded otherwise." Sergeant Love made a small, choking sound, but Purbright silenced him with a glance. "You mean," the inspector said, carefully even, "that your husband's remains became part of his own collection?" The widow's hands tightened briefly, then relaxed. It was fitting. He had desired completeness. He became the 10th. For a moment, silence lay upon them all like a heavy drapery. The tick of the clock on the mantel was suddenly intolerably loud. Love found his voice. "Mrs. Troke, do you understand what you're saying? You kept a corpse, your own husband's, for 20 years. Kept?" She looked at him almost pityingly. "I honoured him. Each day, each meal. That chair," she nodded towards the empty place, "has never been without him." Purbright drew a long breath, the faintest tremor of weariness in it. "Madam, what you describe is not only concealment, it is a crime." Her chin lifted sharply. "And what justice would you serve by exposing it now? Henry is at rest. Do you mean to disturb him, parade him through the courts as a spectacle? He would despise you for it." The inspector studied her with a gaze both steady and grave. He saw no madness in her face, nor remorse. Only the terrible composure of one who had bound herself to a single act and sustained it by ritual for 2 decades. At length he said, "The law does not allow for concealment of a death. You understand that. I understand only that my husband deserved peace." Love shifted, clearly eager to press further, but Purbright raised a hand. "We will not quarrel with you today, madam, but the truth has its own persistence. It does not rest forever beneath earth, nor water, nor ritual." He rose. After a moment, the sergeant followed. Mrs. Troke did not rise with them. She merely watched, her expression distant, already retreating to some private realm. In the street once more, Love exhaled as though he had been holding his breath for hours. "Sir, she's confessed. That's it, isn't it? She kept his body. That's the 10th skull." Purbright shook his head slightly. "A confession is not a conclusion. Did you observe her phrasing? She spoke of a fall in the cellar, of death before she reached him. No mention of violence, yet the bone we recovered bore a mark, an incision not made by accident." Love frowned. "You think she lied?" "I think," said Purbright, "that she told us a story she has told herself for 20 years. Whether she believes it or not, I cannot say, but the body may reveal a harsher truth." They walked on, the mist beginning to lift, revealing the market square in the clarity of late morning. Townsfolk glanced at them curiously, for rumour had already raced ahead. "Sir," Love said hesitantly, "if Henry Troke didn't fall, if he was helped, who would have done it? She herself?" Purbright's eyes were distant. "Or perhaps another, a lodger who disappeared, a quarrel concealed. We must ask again, this time of the cellar itself." That afternoon he obtained a warrant. By dusk, he and Love, together with 2 constables, descended into the Trokes' cellar. The air was thick with damp and dust, carrying a sour tang of mould. Cobwebs veiled the low beams, and along the walls stood shelves of jars whose labels had long since surrendered to rot. In the centre of the floor, worn stone slabs formed a patchwork, one of which bore the faint irregularity of disturbance. "Lift it," Purbright instructed. The men strained with crowbars. At last the stone gave way, revealing a shallow pit. Within lay bones, scattered, partial, but unmistakably human. Some bore signs of careful separation. Love swallowed hard. "So she spoke true. She did keep him here." Purbright bent close, his gaze precise. "And yet, look." On the skull that remained, a jagged depression ran across the temple, sharp-edged, consistent with the blow of an instrument, not a fall. The inspector straightened slowly. His voice, when it came, was calm but cold. Henry Troke did not stumble. He was struck with purpose. The cellar, dim and airless, seemed to close about them, pressing in the knowledge that one woman's fidelity was less than Nasa, it appeared, and that beneath her composure lay the shadow of murder. Purbright turned at last to his men. "Seal this place and send word to the coroner." Love looked at him, pale. "What do we tell her, sir?" The inspector's eyes flickered briefly, almost sorrowfully. "That the dead at last have spoken, and they have not repeated her story." The following day dawned clean and bright, as though the storm of revelations in the cellar had been washed away by the night air. Yet Inspector Purbright carried the weight of it in every step as he crossed the market square. Flaxborough, outwardly serene in its small-town rhythms, seemed to harbour whispers beneath its surface. Shopkeepers, leaning closer in hushed exchanges, postmen pausing at doors to trade sly conjectures, matrons drawing curtains an inch wider at the inspector's passing. Word had spread that something had been unearthed at the Troke house, though what exactly had not yet solidified into common gossip. Purbright stopped at the police station only long enough to leave instructions with Sergeant Love. The sergeant, pink-faced and anxious, had been hovering with barely restrained eagerness to discuss the bones, the fracture on the skull, and the implications for Mrs. Troke's peculiar honouring of her late husband. But Purbright merely told him to prepare the report for the coroner and to begin searching records of local tradesmen who had been called to the Troke house in the winter of Henry's death. "We must know who was in and out of that house at the time," Purbright said, "and whether they have still a pulse to question." By late morning, the inspector was striding up the gravel path of the vicarage. The Reverend Chubb, a portly man with a permanent expression of mingled benevolence and unease, met him at the door. He seemed relieved to see Purbright, though uncertain whether he should be. "Inspector, delicate business, isn't it?" he began, wringing his hands as he ushered Purbright into the drawing-room. "I trust you would not seek a clergyman's commentary on the peculiarities of his flock, but, well, Mrs. Troke is, shall we say, a figure both pitied and feared." Purbright accepted the proffered chair. "Feared, Reverend?" Chubb flushed faintly. "You will not misunderstand me, I hope. The woman's composure, her habits, are unsettling. There have been whispers over the years, visitors not staying long, a certain smell at times explained away by drains. Parishioners have said she speaks as though her husband were present still, in the room with her. One hesitates to challenge a widow in grief, and in her case, grief has been an occupation rather than a condition." The inspector regarded him steadily. "Did you ever visit her house, Reverend?" Chubb nodded, lips pursed. "On occasion. She is not often in want of spiritual counsel, but she invites me once a year, always on the anniversary of Henry's passing. We take tea, she talks of him, and she makes me feel as though I should respond in the present tense. I confess, I have sometimes done so. It was easier." Purbright allowed the silence to lengthen, studying the man until he squirmed. At last he said, "Did she ever admit to you that he was still in the house?" No, only implied it, if implication it was. You see, she would glance at the other chair, nod slightly, pause for a moment as if hearing a reply. In the end, I ceased to be startled by it. But no admission, Inspector, not in words. Purbright inclined his head. "Thank you, Reverend. That is helpful." As he left the vicarage, the inspector reflected that Mrs. Troke had cultivated her illusion carefully, with ritual, until those around her were half persuaded to accept it. But ritual, no matter how well rehearsed, could not erase a fracture in the skull. But that evening, Mrs. Troke was summoned to the station. She arrived precisely on time, her black dress and immaculate apron unchanged, her expression neither fearful nor defensive. She seated herself across from Purbright in the interview room, as though they were once again at her dining table. "Inspector," she said, her voice calm, "I am curious what else you wish to know. I have told you Henry died, and that I kept him." Purbright folded his hands. "Indeed, but the remains tell another tale. The skull bears the mark of a blow, sharp, decisive, not a fall against stone, but an instrument wielded with force." For the first time her eyes flickered, not with fear, but with something close to irritation. "Bones are treacherous witnesses. They may speak, but they do not always say what they mean." "Bones," Purbright replied evenly, "do not invent their stories. They tell what happened, not what is convenient. Henry Troke was struck, Mrs. Troke. He was killed." The widow sat perfectly still, her fingers tightening upon each other only once, before becoming motionless again. After a long pause, she said, If that was so, would it change what I did? Would it alter the years I gave to his memory? It would alter, Purbright said, the question of who else was in your cellar that winter. She regarded him, her expression inscrutable. Then she gave a small, almost amused smile. Ah, you wonder whether it was I? Do you deny it? I do not admit it. The inspector leaned forward slightly. Who else had cause to harm him? Her eyes shifted past him, to some point beyond the wall, as if she saw a figure lingering in the doorway. For a moment, Purbright thought she would remain silent. But then she spoke, low and deliberate. Henry was not a gentle man. He had a temper that burned long after its spark. He quarrelled with many. I cannot say which quarrel ended him. Perhaps it was his own. His own? She looked back at Purbright, her gaze cool. A man may strike himself in anger as well as another, or fall to his knees in a rage and strike his head upon the wall. Do bones tell you whose hand guides the blow? Purbright did not reply. He studied her, seeking the crack beneath her composure. But she gave none. At last, he rose. That will be all for today, madam. She inclined her head, serene once more, and allowed herself to be escorted out. Later that night, in the inspector's office, Love entered, bearing a file bulging with notes. He dropped it on the desk with something like triumph. Sir, I've looked into workmen called to the Troke House in '04. The winter she says he died. One name kept cropping up. A man called Sam Hartley, carpenter, did repairs to the cellar steps, moved away not long after. Purbright looked up sharply. Moved where? Lincoln. Opened a little joinery shop. Still alive. The inspector sat back, considering. Hartley, a carpenter. Convenient, to be working by those cellar steps. Love nodded eagerly. What if he saw Henry fall or struck him in a quarrel over pay? If so, Mrs. Troke might have kept quiet to shield herself from scandal, or perhaps to protect Hartley. Purbright tapped the file, eyes narrowing. Or she shielded neither, but simply found it suited her to keep Henry silent. We must speak with this Hartley. Quietly, before Flaxborough's whispering tongues invent a verdict of their own. Love hesitated, then said, Sir, if it was Hartley, she's been sitting at that table 20 years with a skull she knew wasn't hers to claim. That's ghastly. Purbright's voice was low. Yes, love, but ghastly is not yet the same as guilty. The inspector sat late into the night after Love had gone, his lamp burning across the papers. The words blurred sometimes, his eyes tired, but the fracture on the skull did not blur. It returned to him in clear, cold outline, the sharp depression of a blow that spoke louder than Mrs. Troke's calm, or her rituals, or her refusal to yield. The town outside lay quiet, its shutters closed, its cobbles glistening under the lamplight. Yet Purbright sensed the story moving beneath it, shifting like bones under soil. Somewhere in that quiet lay the truth, not embalmed in ritual, nor concealed in silence, but waiting for the hand that would draw it into daylight. And he resolved that when morning came, his next step would be to follow the carpenter's trail to Lincoln, for only by unearthing the living could he complete the tale of the dead. Inspector Purbright made the journey to Lincoln under a sky that seemed determined to test his patience with both glare and gloom. The sun would appear briefly, glancing off the train carriage window with a teasing brilliance, only to vanish behind a smear of cloud that darkened the passing fields into stretches of dull grey. Flaxborough had clung to him, in spirit if not geography, through every station stop. The town's whispers had a way of following him like smoke. He arrived just after noon. Lincoln bustled, the market square thick with stalls and a constant murmur of trade. To Purbright, accustomed to the quieter cadences of his own borough, the city felt almost metropolitan. Yet his purpose was provincial enough to find a man who once repaired cellar steps and who might have carried a secret for 2 decades. The address Sergeant Love had unearthed proved accurate. A modest shop stood in a side street, its display of polished wood boxes, stools and frames all neatly arranged. The sign above read Samuel Hartley, joiner and cabinet maker. Inside, the smell of sawdust and linseed oil hung pleasantly in the air. Behind a workbench, a man in his late 50s planed the edge of a panel with slow precision. He looked up as Purbright entered, grey-haired, wiry, with lines around his mouth that suggested years of clenched effort rather than laughter. "Good afternoon," Purbright began, removing his hat. "Mr. Hartley?" "Aye." The man set down his tool, wiping his hands on his apron. His accent was still recognizably from the district of Flaxborough, though softened by years away. "And you are?" "Inspector Purbright, Flaxborough Police." Hartley's eyes narrowed just slightly. "Flaxborough? That's a long while since." "Indeed, yet not so long as all that. Do you remember working at the Troke House, winter of '04? The man's hands, still upon the apron, stilled altogether. He did not answer at once. Instead, he busied himself with adjusting the position of the wood upon the bench. When he did speak, his voice was careful. "I did. Cellar steps, rotten boards, dangerous they were." "Dangerous for whom?" "Anyone who used them. I told Mr. Troke as much. He weren't keen on paying." Purbright allowed a pause. "Did you see him often?" Hartley shrugged. "Enough. He were a proud man, quarrelsome. Didn't take kindly to being told he ought to spend money." "Quarrelsome enough to strike you?" Hartley's gaze flickered briefly before settling again. "Words were spoken, a shove or two, but nothing worse. Yet Mr. Troke died that winter, did you know?" The carpenter's mouth tightened. "Everybody knew. It was all over the town." "And did you suspect how?" Hartley looked at Purbright fully then, eyes wary but not evasive. "I suspected he were dead long before the widow said so. Place stank of it. But I didn't go down those steps after the day I finished the job." Purbright studied him. The man's hands were steady, his manner blunt, almost resentful of being asked to rehearse the past. But resentment did not equal guilt. "Sister Hartley," the inspector said quietly, "the remains have been examined. The skull shows a fracture caused by a blow." Something passed over the carpenter's face then, a shadow of memory, or perhaps fear. His voice, when it came, was low. "That weren't my doing, but you saw him last," Purbright pressed. "No." Hartley's voice rose slightly, though it carried the ring of truth. "I left him in his kitchen muttering about bills. He were alive then, sure enough. If he came to grief after, it weren't my hand did it." Purbright considered, then asked, "Do you believe his wife capable?" Hartley gave a bitter little laugh. "Capable? Aye, she were capable of anything when it came to keeping up appearances. If she struck him, it'd be because he mocked her precious order, or because he threatened to leave. I can't say more." The inspector left the shop with more questions than answers. Hartley had denied violence, yet there had been a flicker in his eyes when the blow was mentioned, flicker of recognition, or guilt, or knowledge. Purbright knew only that the carpenter had not forgotten that winter, however hard he worked to bury it beneath sawdust and polish. And that evening, back in Flaxborough, Purbright sat with Sergeant Love in the office. The younger man was eager for news. "Well, sir, did he crack?" Purbright shook his head. "He was troubled, but no confession. He admits to quarrels, to shoves, nothing more." "Maybe he'll crack yet if we keep at him," Love suggested. Perhaps. But I am less persuaded that it was Hartley's hand. The manner of his denial, he believed himself speaking truth, though truth may not always be complete. Love frowned. Then what now? Purbright leaned back. We look again at motive. Who stood to gain by Henry Troke's death? Not Hartley. He left town soon after. Not neighbours, who scarcely cared for him. That leaves his widow. But, sir, Love said hesitantly, wouldn't a woman like her have told you straight out if she'd done it? She doesn't seem the sort to mince words. On the contrary, Purbright replied, she is the very sort to let silence do her speaking, and her silence has lasted 20 years. The next morning, Purbright called again at the Troke house. Mrs. Troke received him with the same immaculate composure. The dining table, he noted, was once again set for two, though no meal had been laid. "Inspector," she said with faint reproach, "you trouble yourself unduly. My affairs are hardly of moment to the borough." "On the contrary," Purbright said, "your affairs are of great moment, for they involve not only memory, but murder." She raised her eyebrows slightly, but did not reply. "I have spoken to Mr. Hartley," the inspector continued. "He recalls your husband well. He recalls quarrels, but he denies striking the blow. If he did not, then I must ask again, who did?" Her gaze flickered, just briefly, towards the chair opposite. Then she said, in a voice almost tender, "Perhaps Henry did. He was ever his own enemy." Purbright regarded her steadily. "That will not suffice, Mrs. Troke. Bones do not lie." A hand struck him. "If not Hartley's, then whose?" For a long time she was silent. The clock ticked in the hall. Dust motes drifted in the sunlight that filtered through lace curtains. At last she said, "If a wife tells you that her husband was cruel, you nod politely and assume she exaggerates. If she tells you that he broke her spirit, you commend her courage for surviving. But if she tells you that one day she could bear it no longer, then you call it murder." Purbright did not move. His voice, when it came, was calm. "Do you tell me that, Mrs. Troke?" Her eyes, dark and steady, met his. "I tell you only this. Henry is still at my table. He will always be, and I did not invite you to dine." She rose, a gesture both dismissal and defiance, and left him sitting. When Purbright returned to the station, he found Sergeant Love hovering anxiously. "Well, sir?" The inspector sat heavily, lighting his pipe before answering. "She dances on the edge of confession, but will not step into it. She admits cruelty, implies resistance, hints at retribution, but she leaves us only inference." "Then we've nothing solid?" "Not yet, but we have a fracture, a quarrelsome man, a carpenter who departed, and a widow who refuses to speak plain. Somewhere among those, Love, lies the truth, and I fear it is nearer at hand than Lincoln." That night, Purbright walked home through the narrow streets, the lamplight glistening on damp cobbles. The town lay quiet, yet in its quietude he felt the weight of eyes, eyes of gossip, eyes of curiosity, eyes of judgment. Flaxborough wanted an answer. It wanted the bones laid bare, the whispers confirmed or silenced. But Purbright, puffing slowly on his pipe, knew the answer was not yet his to give. It waited in the dark corners of Mrs. Troke's house, in the silence that sat across her table, in the memory she had cultivated like a shrine. And he knew with grim certainty that before this inquiry ended, he would have to draw that memory into daylight, whether she willed it or no. Inspector Purbright's sense of timing was as deliberate as his gait. He did not rush at doors with warrant in hand unless he was entirely certain they would not slam upon him. Instead, he preferred to circle them, listening to the hinges weighing the quiet. And so it was that the following morning he chose not to return directly to Mrs. Troke's dining room, but instead to the borough archives, where, amid the dust and disordered catalogues, lay the records of a winter-long past. The clerk, a young man with spectacles that seemed perpetually sliding from his nose, brought box after box to the reading table. "Estate papers, Inspector, probate, taxes, oddments." Purbright thumbed carefully through. Receipts for coal deliveries, notes on tithe payments, correspondence from solicitors who had since themselves been consigned to the earth. What caught his eye at last was a brief letter dated 2 months after Henry Troke's supposed burial. It was addressed not to the widow but to a Mrs. Pashley, her sister in a neighbouring village. "Dearest Clara, you must not visit for a time. Henry is much altered, and I cannot answer questions. Know only that matters are settled in a manner which spares us both shame. I remain your affectionate sister." Purbright closed the folder slowly. "Matters settled," he repeated under his breath. "Not grief expressed, not bereavement endured, settled." By early afternoon he had summoned Sergeant Love and the coroner's assistant, Dr. Glaston. They convened in the small room adjoining the mortuary, a place where clinical white met the gloom of human speculation. "The fracture is decisive?" Purbright asked. Dr. Glaston nodded, peering over pince-nez. "Decisive, yes, a single, firm blow, edge of a blunt instrument. Quite unlike an accidental tumble down steps, I assure you." "And age at death?" 48, no more, and healthy enough otherwise. He would not have died that winter but for another's hand. Purbright thanked him gravely. To Love he said, "Then it is murder, beyond doubt. What we lack is not cause, but cause to speak it aloud. Mrs. Troke's silence has purchased her 20 years of peace. We must now see how far that currency will stretch." And that evening, Purbright invited Mrs. Troke to the station. She came, veiled and immaculate, as though attending a committee meeting rather than interrogation. Love shifted uneasily. He always felt that her composure made their office shabby. "Madam," Purbright began gently, "you know why we ask you here. The remains in your cellar are your husband's. They bear marks of violence. This cannot be doubted." Her gloved hands rested upon her handbag. "Inspector, you repeat yourself. I have already acknowledged Henry's cruelty and his end. What more must I say? That you struck him?" She inclined her head, neither assent nor denial. Purbright leaned forward. "Let me put it thus. You had no children. You had no fortune independent of his. Yet after his death you managed, more than managed. The house was kept, the reputation preserved, the accounts settled. Such achievement was only possible if his disappearance was contrived. By you. You settled matters as you wrote to your sister." Her eyes narrowed. "You have read my letters?" "I have." She drew a breath, controlled but sharp. "Then you know enough. Henry was no loss to the world. He squandered kindness, mocked propriety, and would have dragged me down to ruin. If you seek pity for him, Inspector, you must look elsewhere." Love blurted, "So you admit it, then?" But she turned to him with a look so cold that he subsided at once. Purbright, however, remained calm. "Mrs. Troke, this is not merely a question of pity. It is law. A life was taken. If by your hand, then you must answer." Her voice, when it came, was low and deliberate. "Suppose I say yes. Suppose I tell you that one winter evening, after years of cruelty, I lifted the iron poker and silenced him with a single blow. What then? Do you drag me to trial, parade me before a jury? What end would it serve, save to satisfy the gossip of Flaxborough, which has been fed well enough already? Purbright regarded her steadily. It would serve the end of truth. And truth, madam, is never so overfed that it cannot hunger still. She gave a faint, bitter smile. You are eloquent, Inspector, yet you forget one thing. You cannot prove that I did it. Hartley was there. Others visited. Even the maid heard quarrels, and now Henry is dust. You cannot try dust. With that she rose. If you wish to charge me, do so. If not, allow me to return to my house. I have a table to set. Purbright allowed her to go. Love, after the door closed, exclaimed, But sir, she is good as confessed. Not good enough, Purbright replied. A confession laced with defiance is but performance. A court would call it hearsay. No, she remains free, for now. Later that night, as Purbright walked home across the square, he encountered Miss Teatime, resident of dubious employment but unmatched intelligence. She intercepted him with a smile as sharp as her hatpin. "Inspector," she said lightly, "I hear our dear widow has been summoned. Did she sing?" Purbright gave her a measured look. She hummed a tune of her own choosing. "Which means," Miss Teatime said, slipping her arm through his, "that you require a different orchestra. Allow me to suggest the neighbours. People will say what pride will not." He raised an eyebrow. "And you, of course, will encourage them to say, 'I, Inspector, am but a humble listener, but I know which doors to knock upon.'" Purbright smiled faintly. "Do so discreetly. A widow's composure is brittle, and brittle things shatter loudly." 2 days later, Purbright received a report from Miss Teatime, relayed in her inimitable fashion over tea and currant cake. Mrs. Dobbins across the way recalls hearing a dreadful quarrel the very night Mr. Hartley finished the cellar. She swears she heard a scream, cut short. But of course the widow told her Henry had gone on business, and Mrs. Dobbins is easily persuaded. "And another?" Miss Teatime continued. "A certain Mr. Wickens remembers carting coal for the Trokes that winter. He said Henry often berated his wife in public, calling her barren, foolish, worse. The whole street knew. Yet none questioned when he vanished. Strange, don't you think?" Purbright nodded slowly. "Strange indeed. A man vanishes and the town accepts his widow's explanation without protest, almost as if it wished him gone." "Or wished her preserved," Miss Teatime countered. "Flaxborough is fond of its proprieties. Better a silent widow than a scandalous household." That evening, Purbright sat alone in his office, the lamplight soft upon the papers spread before him. He reviewed the evidence. A fractured skull, undeniably deliberate. A carpenter who quarrelled but fled. A widow who hinted without confessing. Neighbours who remembered violence, then silence. The case was at once clear and obscure. Henry Troke had been killed, but whether by his wife's hand, by Hartley's, or by some hand unconsidered, it was still cloaked. Purbright puffed his pipe and murmured aloud, "Truth does not always come by force. Sometimes it comes by invitation." He closed the file, rose, and looked out into the square. Mrs. Troke's windows were visible across the rooftops, faintly lit. He thought of her solitary meals, the perpetual setting of a table for two, the presence of a ghost she refused to dismiss. "No," he said softly, "she has not yet spoken the whole." And so Chapter 10 closed with the inspector resolved. The truth was nearer than ever, but it would not be seized. It must be coaxed, as one coaxes a wary bird, until at last it flies into the open air. In Flaxborough, rumours travelled not on foot but upon invisible currents, as if the very chimneys exhaled them into the winter air. By the time Inspector Purbright next walked up the High Street, the entire town had acquired an intimate concern for the Troke household. Mrs. Dobbins, whose hearing was said to be as sharp as her pruning shears, repeated for the third time that she distinctly recalled a scream the night Henry disappeared. Mr. Wickens, the coalman, was less precise but more colourful, claiming Henry had a tongue like a lash, and that any saint with a poker would have given him his due. Even the butcher contributed, noting that Mrs. Troke purchased meat only in small, precise quantities thereafter, as though no hearty male were expected at table. Miss Teatime, that tireless curator of Flaxborough's indiscretions, had arranged the symphony. She did not add to the music, she merely conducted it with a wave of her glove and the raising of an eyebrow at the correct intervals. Thus, by the time Purbright received the chorus in his office, it had become less rumour than conviction. Sergeant Love presented the accounts, flushed with excitement. "They're all saying the same thing, sir. Everyone knew the Trokes were at loggerheads. Everyone remembers that quarrel. And not one of them saw Henry leave. That settles it." Purbright tapped the stem of his pipe against his teeth. "What it settles, love, is that Flaxborough is in hearty agreement with itself, which is not the same as agreement with truth. But the widow as much as confessed. Confession uncorroborated is performance, as I told you. We must seek that which cannot be rehearsed." But that evening, Purbright walked to Mrs. Troke's house, unannounced. The windows glowed faintly against the dusk. Within, the familiar ritual of supper was underway. She received him with her usual composure, though he thought her smile a shade more brittle. "Inspector," she said, "you honour me with your frequent visits. Shall I set another plate?" "I fear not, madam. I come not to eat, but to listen." "To what, pray?" Purbright's gaze shifted to the sideboard, where silverware lay neatly polished, each piece aligned with geometric precision. "To the silences in this house," he said softly. "They speak loudly if one is patient." Her eyes narrowed, though her voice remained controlled. "Then you will have heard Henry's silence for 20 years. It cannot be more eloquent than that." "Indeed," said Purbright, "yet silence is never complete. The dead leave echoes, and sometimes so do the living." The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. To Mrs. Troke's visible irritation, the maid, a thin, nervy creature named Elsie, entered to announce a visitor. Behind her stood Miss Teatime, perfectly timed and perfectly dressed. "I do beg pardon, dear Mrs. Troke," she said with unctuous sweetness, "but I thought Inspector Purbright might be in need of refreshment. And you know I never come empty-handed." She held up a tin of almond biscuits, which she promptly placed on the table as though planting a flag. Mrs. Troke's lips tightened, but she could not object. "I was merely telling the inspector," she said coldly, "that my husband's silence is his only contribution now." Miss Teatime's eyes twinkled. "Ah, but silence can be so revealing, don't you think? Why, only yesterday I was told that poor Elsie here once heard a most dreadful thud in the cellar. Isn't that so, child?" Elsie, caught in the crossfire, stammered. Yes, miss, that night. I was polishing the grate. There was a crash, like someone dropped a sack of coal, then a shout, then nothing." Mrs. Troke turned sharply upon the girl. "And why did you not tell me this before?" Elsie looked as though she might faint. "I thought it was not my place, mum, and you said master had gone away." Purbright intervened gently. "Yet you remember it still. And memory, Elsie, is sometimes the one servant who does not leave his post." The girl flushed scarlet and fled from the room, leaving behind a silence far heavier than any words. When the door closed, Mrs. Troke faced them both with a strange, almost regal defiance. "You marshal servants and neighbours against me, Inspector. Do you imagine this alters the truth?" "It alters the weight of it," Purbright replied. "One recollection may be error, a chorus of them is testimony." Miss Teatime, who had been idly sampling a biscuit, added cheerfully, "And besides, my dear, it is always the servants who undo us, queens, widows, even magistrates. It is the girl with the duster who remembers everything." But the days that followed brought further confirmations. Mrs. Pashley, the widow's sister, reluctantly admitted that a letter had indeed reached her, in which Euphemia, for such was the widow's name, confessed to a settlement of her difficulties with Henry. "She begged me not to inquire further," Mrs. Pashley said, dabbing her eyes. "I thought it was some quiet separation. I never dreamed—" Purbright thanked her kindly. He did not press. The letter itself was eloquent enough. The evidence now resembled not a puzzle with missing pieces, but a portrait blurred by deliberate smudging. The outline was clear. Henry Troke had been slain, and his wife had engineered his concealment. Yet the final stroke, the decisive hand, was still obscured. Purbright considered Hartley the carpenter. Might he, in passion or in defence of the widow, have dealt the fatal blow? Or had Mrs. Troke herself seized the poker in a moment of desperation? It was at this juncture that fate, or rather Flaxborough's inexhaustible appetite for mischief, provided the final twist. Sergeant Love entered one morning holding a parcel. "Found in the post, sir. Addressed to you. No sender." Inside was a small, rusted object, the head of an iron poker, broken clean at the shaft. Attached was a slip of paper in a spidery feminine hand. "This is what ended Henry. Keep my name from it, but let justice know." Purbright examined the handwriting, the rust, the jagged break. He said nothing for a long time, only turning the fragment slowly in his hands. At last he spoke. "The sender meant it as evidence, love, but it is also an absolution. A soul too long burdened has lightened itself." "Do you think it was the widow, sir?" Purbright shook his head. "Number Euphemia Troke would never yield the stage so tamely. This comes from another hand, perhaps Clara Pashley, perhaps Elsie, perhaps some confidant we shall never name. But one thing is certain. Henry's silence has now been broken." That evening, Purbright walked once more past the Troke residence. Through the curtains he glimpsed the widow alone at her table, 2 places set, the second untouched as always. She ate with perfect decorum, lifting each morsel as though it were an act of defiance against the years. He did not knock, he did not intrude. The law might yet pursue her, but Purbright sensed that justice, in its own patient, inexorable way, was already at work. For a house in which every supper is taken in the company of an absent ghost is punishment enough for any mortal woman. Thus, Chapter 11 concluded. The net drawn tighter, the evidence amassed, the widow's mask cracking at the edges, only one chapter remained, in which truth itself must step forward, not as rumour, not as suspicion, but as the final, unalterable verdict. The court of law, when it finally convened upon the matter of Euphemia Troke, had all the solemnity of a theatre whose actors were more anxious than accomplished. It was not the Crown Court, nor anything grand enough to be reported beyond the county pages of a provincial newspaper. Yet within Flaxborough the hearing was treated with a reverence that would not have disgraced the trial of a queen. Mrs. Dobbin secured her place in the public gallery hours before the doors opened, carrying sandwiches wrapped in greaseproof paper. The coal man Wickens brought with him a cousin from Sleaford, promising him a spectacle unmatched by any market-day brawl. Miss Teatime, of course, presided from the front row as if she herself were directing the proceedings. At the centre, on a chair uncomfortably straight and bare, sat Mrs. Euphemia Troke. She had dressed as though for a funeral, the funeral, one suspected, not of Henry Troke, but of her own unyielding pride. A plain black gown, a veil half drawn, hands folded in white gloves that suggested she might yet dismiss the whole business with a flick of her wrist. Inspector Purbright, who gave evidence with his usual composure, was neither theatrical nor apologetic. He recounted the fragments patiently gathered, the quarrels recalled by neighbours, the thud in the cellar reported by Elsie, the letter to Mrs. Pashley hinting at a settlement, and finally the poker-head parcel delivered anonymously to his office. The magistrate, a man with a pink nose and a disinclination for drama, listened in silence, occasionally polishing his spectacles with a movement that implied both doubt and discomfort. Sergeant Love, called to the stand, was more emphatic. His narrative grew as he spoke. Henry's temper became fiercer, the neighbours' recollections more exact, the suspicions more damning. By the time he had finished, half the gallery were convinced they had personally witnessed the murder. Miss Teatime smiled serenely, as though listening to an opera she had herself composed. But the defence, a thin, nervous solicitor from Boston, attempted to dismantle the edifice. He argued that there was no body, no direct witness, and no proof that the poker-head had ever belonged to the Troke household. What we have, he insisted, is gossip, supposition, and the imaginings of servants. At this, Mrs. Troke raised her chin a fraction, as if to remind the court that she was herself of a higher order than either servants or gossips. And then came the moment expected by all but prepared for by none. Euphemia Troke, when invited to speak, did not deny, nor did she admit. She merely addressed the magistrate in a voice level and unwavering. "My husband," she said, "was a man of cruelty. Not the cruelty that bruises the skin, but the kind that gnaws daily upon the soul. He despised me, sir. He made of our home a prison and of our marriage a sentence. One night, the sentence ended. Whether by his hand or mine, or perhaps by the hand of Providence, I cannot say. But I tell you this. I have lived every day since in his company, though he is absent from the table. I have set his plate, I have poured his tea. I have endured his silence, as I once endured his scorn. That is punishment enough, and no jail can add to it." A rustle spread through the gallery. Mrs. Dobbins dropped her sandwich. Wickens's cousin whispered, "By God, she's confessed." Miss Teatime dabbed her lips with a lace handkerchief and sighed with exquisite satisfaction. But the magistrate cleared his throat. "Mrs. Troke, the law requires more than poetry. It requires proof, and proof in this matter is lamentably absent. We have conjecture, we have fragments, we have sentiment. What we do not have is certainty." He turned to Purbright. "Inspector, can you produce the remains of the late Henry Troke?" Purbright's answer was quiet but firm. "No, sir." "Can you swear upon your office that the poker-head is the very weapon alleged?" "No, sir. I can only state that it is consistent." The magistrate sighed, placed his spectacles back upon his nose, and delivered his ruling with the weary air of a man absolving himself of responsibility. "In the absence of a body, and in the absence of conclusive evidence, I cannot bind this woman over for trial. She is free to go." The gasp that followed was almost theatrical in itself. Love looked thunderstruck. Miss Teatime looked delighted. Mrs. Dobbins muttered that the world was going to pieces. Wickens's cousin demanded his railway fare back. As for Euphemia Troke, she rose with dignity, adjusted her gloves, and inclined her head slightly towards the magistrate. Then, without a word to the crowd, she swept from the court. Outside, in the raw air of late afternoon, Purbright found her standing by the steps, staring into the distance as though expecting Henry himself to emerge from the fog. "You are free," he said. She turned slowly, her face pale beneath the veil. "Am I, Inspector, I wonder?" There was no triumph in her voice, no relief, only that same strange composure that had marked her every appearance. Purbright bowed his head slightly. "The law cannot compel you further, but conscience is its own jailer." She regarded him for a long moment, then walked away, her figure diminishing down the street until it seemed she might dissolve entirely into the mist. On that evening, Miss Teatime called upon Purbright in his office. She brought a small basket of currant buns, which she insisted would steady his nerves. "Well," she said brightly, "it ended exactly as I knew it would. These matters always do. The guilty walk free, the innocent are never quite believed, and the neighbours have something to dine upon for years." Purbright smiled faintly. "And what is your verdict, Miss Teatime? Guilty or innocent?" She took a bun, nibbled delicately, and replied, "Both, and neither. That is the charm of Flaxborough. We never quite punish, we never quite absolve, we merely live among the whispers." Later, as Purbright walked home along the quiet streets, he reflected on her words. The lamps glowed dimly, the air was sharp with frost, and in the distance he thought he heard the tolling of the church clock. He knew the truth would never be entirely revealed. Whether Euphemia had struck the blow, or whether some other hand, Hartley's perhaps, had intervened, mattered less than the fact that Henry Troke's absence weighed heavier upon her than his presence ever had. Justice, he thought, was not always a verdict pronounced from the bench. Sometimes it was the nightly ritual of a solitary woman laying two places at a table, hearing the scrape of a phantom chair, and living forever with the silence she had once desired. Thus ended the case of the widow who slept with a skeleton. No gallows, no sentence, no headline trial, only the quiet, relentless punishment of memory. And so Inspector Purbright returned to his duties, lighting his pipe with habitual calm, prepared for the next oddity Flaxborough might present. For in that town, as in all others, the dead never quite departed, and the living never quite confessed.